Imagine a ruler whose name alone could stop armies in their tracks, whose presence turned whispers into trembling fear, and whose methods of enforcing authority were so extreme that they became legend across an entire continent. In the shadowed forests and fortified castles of 15th century Wallachia, one man's approach to power blurred the line between justice and terror. Tales of staggering punishments, public executions, and psychological warfare spread like wildfire, leaving both subjects and enemies wary of crossing him. This is a story not just of a prince, but of a carefully orchestrated reign, where fear became a weapon, reputation a tool, and brutality a message that traveled faster than armies. Step into a world where power was enforced with precision, and survival often depended on understanding the mind behind the legend. The man behind the legend, Vlad III, later infamously known as Vlad the Impaler, did not enter the world destined to terrify Europe. He was born into a world that demanded ruthlessness. The year was 1431, in the fortress city of Sighisoara, in the region of Transylvania, part of the Kingdom of Hungary. His father, Vlad II Dracul, had earned his surname Dracul from the Order of the Dragon, a knightly order sworn to defend Christendom against Ottoman expansion. From the outset, young Vlad's life was defined by political turbulence, shifting alliances, and threats that modern children's nightmares could scarcely rival. Nobles bickering over territories, boyars plotting betrayals, and external threats from the Ottoman Empire created an environment where trust was a currency more precious than gold, and often as fleeting. Vlad's formative years were spent observing his father navigate a perilous political landscape, a constant demonstration that mercy and weakness could be fatal. By age 12, Vlad's childhood curiosity had already been shaped by caution, suspicion, and an emerging fascination with authority. Historical accounts suggest that his father sent him and his younger brother, Radu, as hostages to the Ottoman court in 1442 to guarantee Wallachian loyalty. The psychological impact of these years cannot be overstated. A boy surrounded by the threat of execution, witnessing torture, and navigating court intrigue daily, would either break or adapt, and Vlad adapted with precision. The psychological imprints of captivity under Murad II's court left him acutely aware of power, fear, and survival, laying the groundwork for the man who would later merge justice and terror into a single instrument. Even before assuming power, Vlad's observations of human behavior in extreme circumstances were meticulous. He noted which guards used intimidation effectively, which diplomats relied on deceit, and which prisoners crumbled under duress. By the time he returned to Wallachia, he had already internalized a philosophy that would later define his reign. Fear was as potent a tool as any sword. Yet, it wasn't purely cruelty for cruelty's sake. Chronicles suggest that Vlad's later insistence on public punishments and impalement stemmed from lessons learned in these early years. Fear could enforce order, loyalty, and survival where words failed. The domestic environment of his youth was equally influential. Vlad II Dracul's court in Wallachia was rife with rival boyars, whose ambition and cunning rivaled any military threat. Young Vlad watched as favoritism, betrayal, and political maneuvering directly affected life and death. In 1447, when Vlad's father and older brother Mircea were assassinated by rebellious boyars in a sudden attack at Targovishte, Vlad witnessed firsthand the lethal consequences of indecision and misplaced trust. This moment, documented in both Wallachian chronicles and later Ottoman records, marked a turning point. Fear and retribution were no longer abstract concepts. They were survival imperatives, engraved into the mind of a boy who would soon ascend to power with the resolve of someone who had seen betrayal up close. Education was pragmatic and far from sentimental. Vlad was trained in military strategy, horseback riding, swordsmanship, and administration. However, lessons were never devoid of reminders of mortality. In some accounts, he was present when captured prisoners were executed or threatened with impalement, a practice that would later define his reign. He studied both the mechanics and the psychological impact, noting that a single carefully staged display of punishment could silence dissent far more efficiently than months of negotiation or diplomacy. Such observations demonstrate that the infamous cruelty attributed to Vlad was inseparable from an intense, analytical mind, shaped under extreme conditions. By the time Vlad returned to Wallachia in 1448, he was no longer merely the son of a prince. He was a man forged in the crucible of captivity, political intrigue, and calculated observation. Every encounter with betrayal, every exposure to the precarious balance between power and death, contributed to a worldview in which order demanded unwavering enforcement, and terror was an efficient instrument. From the icy corridors of Sigishwara to the shadowed halls of Murad II's court, Vlad's experiences accumulated into a singular understanding. Control could be absolute only when fear became a universal language, spoken fluently and without mercy, a principle he would apply relentlessly once he became ruler of Wallachia. The political chessboard of Wallachia. Wallachia, in the mid-15th century, was not a land for the faint of heart. Small, mountainous, and strategically positioned between the Ottoman Empire and the Kingdom of Hungary, it was a prize for any power-seeking influence in Eastern Europe. Young Vlad, freshly returned from Ottoman captivity in 1448, stepped into a realm where every alliance, treaty, and greeting carried the potential for betrayal. His father's death had left a fractured political landscape, and boyars Wallachian nobles were notorious for shifting loyalties at the drop of a coin. Understanding this precarious environment is essential to grasp why Vlad would later embrace fear as both weapon and governance. The Ottoman Empire loomed constantly to the south. By the 1440s, Murad II's armies had expanded deep into the Balkans, and Wallachia, as a border principality, was effectively a buffer state. Tributary demands were frequent, and failure to comply could invite punitive campaigns. Vlad's years as an Ottoman hostage provided first-hand experience of their discipline, military strategy, and political cunning. While technically a guest, he observed the empire's methods of maintaining loyalty and control, noting how fear and public punishment reinforced authority. The contrast between Ottoman might and Wallachian independence was stark, and Vlad learned early that survival required both cunning diplomacy and ruthless enforcement. To the west, Hungary's influence was equally complex. Vlad's early life had coincided with the reign of King Ladislaus the Posthumous, followed by Matthias Corvinus in 1458. Hungarian support was tenuous. Wallachian princes often swore fealty one day and faced military pressure the next. Local boyars leveraged these international tensions to challenge princely authority, frequently plotting assassinations or siding with whichever external power promised the most immediate advantage. These shifting allegiances created a perpetual environment of uncertainty, forcing Vlad to consider preemptive measures against threats both external and internal. The boyars themselves were the most immediate political threat. Powerful families such as the Craiovesti held significant influence over Wallachian governance and were adept at exploiting princely weakness. Historical accounts from the 1440s indicate that boyars often conspired to replace the reigning prince with a more compliant candidate, aligning with foreign powers to achieve their ends. Vlad's awareness of these tendencies, sharpened during his formative years in captivity, meant that he approached negotiations with suspicion, always anticipating betrayal. Records from his first reign note that he executed or imprisoned boyars who displayed disloyalty, establishing a precedent that would both terrify and stabilize the principality. Vlad's early exposure to this political chessboard also included observing propaganda in action. Letters from Ottoman and Hungarian courts circulated accounts of loyalty, betrayal, and punishment, shaping perceptions across borders. Vlad realized that fear could be amplified by reputation alone. A single violent act against a traitorous noble could ripple outward, influencing not only internal politics but also foreign diplomacy. His eventual reputation for impalement and extreme punishment was not incidental. It was rooted in a keen understanding of the psychological power of terror as a diplomatic tool. Internal politics were further complicated by Wallachia's fragmented geography. Mountain passes, dense forests, and fortified towns created pockets of autonomous power, where boyars could resist princely orders with relative impunity. Historical chronicles describe instances in 1447 and 1448, where newly returned princes struggled to assert authority, sometimes requiring months to consolidate power over a single county. Vlad's approach combined military precision with calculated brutality. Insurgent nobles were often executed publicly, and impalements or mutilations were staged to communicate both punishment and deterrence. These actions, though gruesome, were designed to reduce repeated rebellion and convey that resistance had a tangible cost. By the time Vlad assumed full control of Wallachia in the late 1000s, 440s, he had already internalized a complex equation: the survival of the state, the maintenance of authority, and the management of unruly nobles depended on strategic alliances tempered with uncompromising displays of punishment. The political chessboard of Wallachia was lethal, and Vlad moved as both player and arbiter, understanding that hesitation, indecision, or misplaced mercy could be fatal. Every alliance with Hungary, every tribute paid to the Ottomans, and every confrontation with the boyars was calculated not merely for immediate survival, but for establishing a long-term reputation as a ruler whose authority was absolute, whose fear was contagious, and whose vengeance was swift and public. Impalement, the signature punishment. Few punishments in history have inspired as much fear and fascination as impalement, and Vlad III perfected it into both a tool of terror and a method of governance. Unlike the sanitized portrayals in popular media, the impalement used in 15th century Wallachia was meticulously designed for maximum psychological impact. Vlad's first recorded use of impalement dates to his early reign in 1456, shortly after reclaiming the throne from rival boyars. Historical chronicles describe these executions in both horrifying and precise detail. The condemned would be carefully selected, their crimes, whether theft, betrayal, or insubordination, publicly announced, and the punishment carried out before crowds gathered to witness the consequences of disloyalty. The method itself was deceptively simple, but excruciatingly effective. A large, sharpened wooden stake was prepared, often oiled to ease entry, and driven through the body, sometimes vertically through the torso, sometimes starting at the rectum or vagina for particular offenders. Depending on the victim's physical condition, impalement could result in death within minutes, or prolonged suffering for hours or even days. Vlad's chronicles describe instances where impaled victims were placed along main roads, serving as grim markers to anyone considering treachery. By positioning the corpses where travelers would encounter them daily, he transformed the landscape into a silent yet brutal warning system. Contemporary observers documented the psychological effects. German, Venetian, and Hungarian chroniclers repeatedly noted that Vlad's forests of impaled corpses induced panic in anyone crossing Wallachian territory. One 1462 report by a Hungarian envoy mentions, "The roads are lined with stakes upon which the bodies of traitors and Turks hang, and travelers pass quickly, eyes averted, trembling at the sight." Modern readers might struggle to visualize the scale, but historians estimate that hundreds of victims were impaled during major campaigns, particularly during conflicts with the Ottoman forces. For Vlad, this was not merely cruelty. It was statecraft. Vlad's signature approach extended beyond the act itself. He carefully controlled the environment, the witnesses, and the aftermath. Victims were often chosen for maximum narrative effect. High-ranking boyars who betrayed him might be impaled near their own estates, and captured Ottoman soldiers were sometimes executed in lines so extensive that even their allies reportedly fled at the sight. One account details a 1462 campaign where over 20 impaled soldiers were displayed along the Danube, visible from the river, as a warning to approaching Ottoman ships. This form of public terror transformed impalement into a psychological weapon that extended far beyond the battlefield. It's also important to note that Vlad employed impalement with a sense of calculated fairness, at least by his standards. Crimes were weighed, and punishments meted according to perceived severity. Thieves, spies, and boyars guilty of betrayal were routinely impaled, but those who demonstrated loyalty or courage might be spared, sometimes publicly, reinforcing the perception that obedience could protect life while disobedience guaranteed death. This mixture of calculated terror and conditional mercy amplified the method's effectiveness, encouraging both fear and compliance. While impalement was Vlad's most notorious tool, it was not his only method of punishment. He supplemented it with flaying, mutilation, and other public executions, often combining them to maximize shock. Yet impalement remained his signature, the act that earned him the moniker Mépes, or the Impaler, and ensured that tales of his cruelty spread across Europe with unprecedented speed. Diplomats and merchants carried these stories to courts in Hungary, the Holy Roman Empire, and beyond, making Vlad's reputation a form of diplomacy in itself. The spectacle of impalement also served a secondary purpose. It reinforced Vlad's control over his own people. Wallachian peasants, who might otherwise be vulnerable to the predations of rogue boyars or invading forces, observed the consequences of rebellion in the most concrete terms imaginable. By visibly punishing traitors, Vlad simultaneously established order, secured loyalty, and created an environment where the threat of impalement deterred potential uprisings. In essence, impalement was both punishment and preventative strategy, an early example of psychological warfare codified into governance. Even centuries later, the legacy of Vlad's impalements endures in both historical records and folklore. By combining precise execution, public spectacle, and strategic placement, he transformed a method of execution into a tool that controlled, intimidated, and defined an entire region. Roads, fields, and forests became instruments of his authority, and the sheer scale of his actions ensured that fear became a language understood by everyone who lived, traveled, or invaded Wallachia. Psychological warfare. If impalement was Vlad's hammer, then psychological warfare was his precision instrument. The forests, roads, and towns of Wallachia were not only battlefields but stages for a carefully orchestrated campaign of terror designed to control enemies before a single sword was drawn. Vlad III understood that fear could achieve what armies alone could not, and his campaigns in the 1450s and 1460s provide some of the earliest documented examples of systematic psychological warfare in European history. One of the most notorious strategies involved what chroniclers described as the Forest of the Impaled. In 1462, after repelling Ottoman forces led by Mehmed II's vassals, Vlad reportedly impaled more than 20,000 prisoners along the road between Targovishte and the Danube. These stakes, extending for miles, were positioned so travelers, merchants, and enemy forces would encounter them on approach. Contemporary Hungarian records note that soldiers who witnessed the scene reportedly abandoned their campaigns in panic, retreating with few attempts at confrontation. For Vlad, these displays were not merely punishment, but communication, a vivid, unambiguous message that disobedience or invasion would yield unimaginable consequences. Psychological warfare extended beyond numbers and spectacle. Vlad carefully staged executions to amplify terror. High-ranking traitors were impaled near their own estates, creating a scenario where local populations would literally walk past the consequences of betrayal every day. In 1457, a documented case involved a boyar who had plotted against Vlad. He was executed along a main thoroughfare, with his family forced to witness the aftermath. Villagers reportedly fled the area for days, fearful that similar fates could befall them. By combining location, audience, and punishment, Vlad ensured that fear spread organically, embedded within daily life. Vlad's use of terror was highly strategic in military campaigns as well. Ottoman raiders often entered Wallachia under the assumption that they would face conventional resistance. Instead, they encountered booby-trapped villages, bodies left deliberately in the open, and false retreats that lured forces into prepared ambushes. One 1462 campaign report describes an Ottoman column forced to navigate through a corridor flanked by impaled corpses, only to be attacked from hidden positions in nearby forests. This integration of psychological and tactical warfare disrupted enemy morale and often led to retreats without direct combat, saving Vlad's forces considerable resources. The impact on Wallachian society was equally deliberate. Peasants, who might otherwise question a prince's authority or align with rogue boyars, observed firsthand the consequences of disobedience. Historical accounts indicate that the display of executed traitors, thieves, and spies created an environment where compliance became a matter of survival. Even those who feared Vlad personally recognized that the system enforced order, and public perception of his ruthlessness extended authority beyond the castle walls into every village and town. Foreign observers played a role in amplifying Vlad's psychological influence. Letters, envoy reports, and merchant diaries spread news of his punishments across Europe. Chroniclers in Hungary, Germany, and Venice recorded vivid descriptions of impalements, mutilations, and calculated massacres. These accounts, sometimes exaggerated but always grounded in documented events, enhanced Vlad's reputation far beyond Wallachia. Diplomats negotiating treaties or arranging marriages reportedly carried tales of his cruelty into royal courts, where they functioned as both cautionary tales and leverage. Vlad's psychological campaigns also included subtler tactics. He manipulated rumors and stories, encouraging whispers of sudden executions or surprise inspections. Chronicles mention peasants warning each other of unseen patrols or reporting imaginary sightings of impaled traitors along minor roads. Even the threat of punishment, amplified by imagination and rumor, became a tool of governance. Fear, in this sense, was a currency, exchanged for obedience and loyalty. By 1462, psychological warfare had become integral to Vlad's rule. Impalement and public terror were only part of the strategy. Calculated displays, rumors, and the manipulation of perception ensured that control was maintained without constant physical engagement. His campaigns demonstrate an early, sophisticated understanding of fear as a force multiplier, capable of shaping behavior, deterring invasions, and enforcing authority at all levels of society. In essence, Vlad had transformed the act of punishment into a weapon whose reach extended far beyond the immediate victim, influencing armies, boyars, peasants, and even foreign rulers alike. Punishments for betrayal. Betrayal was a currency Vlad III never tolerated, and his response to disloyalty was as methodical as it was terrifying. In Wallachia, during the mid-15th century, allegiances were fragile, with boyars frequently scheming to replace the prince or curry favor with foreign powers. Vlad's early exposure to political treachery, both from rival nobles and his own captivity in the Ottoman court, from 1442 to 1448, shaped his understanding that fear, when applied decisively, could enforce loyalty in a way negotiation or diplomacy never could. The punishments he devised were grimly inventive. Historical records from Targovishte indicate that boyars caught conspiring against him faced a variety of executions designed to both punish the individual and serve as a public lesson. A boyar named Basarab Laiota, who had plotted to undermine Vlad in 1456, was reportedly skinned alive and then impaled on a stake near the city gates. Chronicles emphasize that Vlad ensured the visibility of these executions. The bodies were not merely disposed of, but displayed where passing villagers, merchants, and fellow nobles could witness the consequences of treachery firsthand. Vlad's sense of justice in these matters was guided by strict proportionality. Minor acts of disobedience could result in mutilation rather than death, ensuring the punishment matched the perceived betrayal. One record from 1461 describes a boyar caught embezzling taxes. His nose and ears were cut off, and he was sent back to his estate with explicit instructions to inform the local population of the consequences of defying princely authority. The boyar's survival served as both a warning and a cautionary tale, reinforcing obedience while conserving Vlad's pool of potential administrators. Not all betrayals were political in nature. Some were military. Captured soldiers who defected or deserted during campaigns often faced execution in ways meant to terrorize both peers and enemies. Chronicles of the 1462 Ottoman incursion describe prisoners being impaled in ranks along the Danube banks, creating a tableau that reportedly caused even seasoned Ottoman commanders to reconsider further attacks. In these cases, the spectacle served a dual purpose: eliminating disloyal combatants and leveraging their fate to intimidate future adversaries, both within and outside Wallachia. Vlad also used creativity to enforce a chilling logic. In one documented incident, a boyar who attempted to poison the prince was forced to ingest a potion of black pepper and vinegar before being impaled, a method ensuring that the victim experienced the torment of punishment before death, heightening the psychological impact for onlookers. Another account mentions conspirators having their heads sewn onto stakes and displayed outside their own estates, an unmistakable reminder to neighbors and relatives of the consequences of treason. Loyalty, in Vlad's Wallachia, was therefore both rewarded and enforced. A noble who complied with his decrees and demonstrated obedience could expect protection and favor, while betrayal guaranteed spectacle and suffering. The meticulous documentation of punishments seen in both local records and foreign chronicles reveals that Vlad was not acting impulsively, but following a strategic pattern designed to instill a pervasive sense of vigilance and fear. Hungarian and Venetian ambassadors repeatedly noted the impact of these measures. describing how even discussions of conspiracy were often silenced by the mere rumor of an impending execution. The psychological reach of these punishments extended to ordinary citizens as well. Villagers understood that boyar betrayals could have cascading effects. If a local noble fell from grace, taxes could increase, lands could be seized, and punishments could spread to anyone associated with the traitor. The unpredictability of Vlad's response, combined with its visibility, ensured that loyalty was less a matter of affection than survival. Public executions, mutilations, and displays of corpses were part of a carefully engineered system to reinforce authority across social hierarchies. By codifying terror as a means of governance, Vlad transformed betrayal from a private act into a public event, creating a culture in which disloyalty carried both immediate and far-reaching consequences. His punishments were grotesque, yet they were also deliberate, proportionate to offense, and strategically applied to ensure maximum impact. The combination of spectacle, calculated cruelty, and methodical enforcement established a precedent in Wallachia. Betraying the prince was not merely dangerous, it was unthinkable. Torture of invaders. Wallachia's borders in the mid-15th century were a constant battlefield, and Vlad III had little patience for invaders who underestimated his ruthlessness. The Ottoman Empire, in particular, tested Wallachian defenses repeatedly, with raiding parties, supply expeditions, and reconnaissance units probing his lands. Rather than simply defeating these forces in combat, Vlad employed a range of torture methods designed to demoralize, intimidate, and spread word of Wallachian terror far beyond the battlefield. Historical accounts suggest that these tactics were not random acts of cruelty, but carefully calculated strategies to maintain control over a small principality surrounded by powerful neighbors. Captured Ottoman soldiers frequently became the subjects of experiments in fear. One chronicler writing in 1462 described a column of approximately 20 Ottoman raiders ambushed near the city of Targovishte. Those captured were subjected to extreme punishments, including impalement, dismemberment, and burning, often in full view of retreating comrades. The intention was explicit. The surviving enemy would carry tales of Wallachia merciless prince, ensuring that future incursions were approached with caution, hesitation, or avoided altogether. Vlad's systematic cruelty, in this sense, functioned as both deterrent and psychological weapon. Not all tortures were uniform. Vlad adjusted methods based on the perceived severity of offenses or the rank of the captives. Lower-ranking soldiers might be impaled at a slower angle, leaving them conscious for hours, while officers or commanders could face decapitation or elaborate displays designed to humiliate and terrorize. One documented example involved Ottoman commanders forced to watch their own men executed before being impaled themselves, sending a direct message that leadership carried responsibility for the lives of subordinates. Venetian diplomats noted that these measures often caused disarray among Ottoman units, eroding morale before battles even began. Vlad also employed inventive methods to instill fear without necessarily reducing enemy numbers immediately. Records describe prisoners tied to stakes and suspended over fires just enough to burn clothing and cause extreme suffering without immediate death. Others were subjected to exposure during harsh winter conditions, stripped to the waist, with guards demonstrating that survival depended entirely on obedience and submission. Chroniclers emphasized that these practices were highly visible, occurring along roads, river crossings, and strategic points where retreating forces or spies could witness the consequences of defiance firsthand. Beyond physical torment, Vlad understood the power of intimidation through manipulation of the senses. Stories from 1462 describe decapitated heads displayed atop stakes along the Danube, arranged with the eyes and mouths open to simulate expressions of terror. In some cases, severed heads were sent to Ottoman commanders as both warning and message, confirming that Wallachian forces would punish incursions swiftly and visibly. These techniques leveraged psychological shock to magnify Vlad's military advantage, turning even a small Wallachian force into an imposing deterrent through fear alone. Vlad's cruelty extended to captured raiding parties attempting to pillage villages. Those caught were sometimes forced into gruesome labor before execution, such as digging graves for comrades who had already been impaled or assisting in the construction of defensive works while under threat of death. Chronicles suggest that this dual-purpose tactic not only punished intruders, but also contributed to strengthening Wallachian fortifications, blending military utility with terror The effectiveness of these methods was widely recognized by foreign observers. Hungarian and Venetian envoys repeatedly remarked on the efficiency of Vlad's fear-based tactics, noting that Ottoman and Wallachian adversaries alike often fled at the mere mention of his name. One 1462 report indicates that a raiding party abandoned a planned incursion after learning that previous attackers had been impaled along the roads. Word of these atrocities spread through letters, merchant networks, and diplomatic correspondence, amplifying the impact of Vlad's punishments beyond Wallachia's borders. By treating torture as both punishment and strategy, Vlad turned acts of cruelty into instruments of governance and defense. His techniques reinforced a broader system in which fear became a tool not only to control enemies, but also to maintain authority internally. In Wallachia, the line between military strategy and psychological warfare was deliberately blurred, and every captured invader became both a victim and a messenger, carrying the story of Vlad III's merciless approach across Europe and the Ottoman Empire alike. Vlad's justice in the countryside. Life in Wallachia's countryside under Vlad III was defined by a tense balance between loyalty and fear. While the prince's reputation for cruelty is often associated with political enemies or invading armies, his methods extended deep into rural communities. Peasants, merchants, and local officials lived under a system where minor infractions could result in extreme punishments, and enforcement was visible, deliberate, and highly publicized. Vlad understood that the stability of his rule depended on controlling not just the nobility, but also the populations whose labor and resources sustained the principality. The severity of rural justice under Vlad was influenced by the context of the time. Wallachia in the mid-15th century was a patchwork of villages and estates, each overseen by boyars who often struggled to enforce laws independently. Vlad took direct control when he suspected corruption, theft, or espionage, viewing any disruption as a threat to his authority. One documented case, in 1457, involved a village near Targovishte where several peasants were caught stealing grain. Vlad personally ordered the offenders impaled in the village square, ensuring that the community witnessed the consequences of disloyalty. Chronicles note that these events were meticulously arranged to maximize their psychological impact, turning ordinary agricultural fields into theaters of punishment. Vlad's approach to justice was deliberately calculated rather than purely reactive. Records describe instances where suspected collaborators with Ottoman raiders were rounded up and executed, even if the evidence was circumstantial. The principle was simple. Collective responsibility reinforced vigilance. Villages were expected to police themselves, knowing that failure to report treason or theft could result in mass punishment. One chronicler recounts a village where suspected informants were impaled alongside livestock as a grim reminder of the prince's reach and attention to detail. Punishments were not limited to impalement. Vlad frequently employed mutilation to enforce obedience and communicate lessons. Thieves could have ears or noses removed, while deserters or suspected conspirators might face temporary imprisonment, followed by public display. Villagers sometimes found themselves forced to assist in their neighbors' executions, either by preparing stakes, digging graves, or constructing scaffolds. These methods were intended not only to punish the guilty, but also to create communal awareness of the consequences of wrongdoing, embedding fear into the social fabric. Vlad also recognized the symbolic value of location in his punishments. Offenders were often executed near roads or intersections used by merchants and travelers. In one case, from 1461, a band of poachers was impaled along the main trade route to Brasov. Travelers recorded seeing the bodies as they passed, spreading tales of Wallachian severity across neighboring regions. This deliberate positioning transformed executions into strategic tools of psychological control, reinforcing Vlad's authority both locally and abroad. Even small acts of resistance could provoke disproportionate responses. Historical records suggest that villagers who failed to meet tax quotas or resisted conscription faced severe repercussions. In 1459, a dispute over livestock grazing led Vlad to impale several local peasants, using the act to assert dominance over disputed lands. These punishments reinforced the message that personal grievances, disputes, or negligence could quickly escalate into life-threatening consequences if the prince perceived a challenge to his authority. Vlad's rural enforcement also reflected his interest in long-term governance, rather than momentary vengeance. By maintaining constant surveillance, employing local informants, and instituting harsh consequences for even minor crimes, he created an environment where fear became a routine aspect of daily life. Villagers quickly learned to comply with laws, report suspicious activity, and maintain loyalty to avoid attracting the prince's attention. The system was brutal, but remarkably effective, in a region where centralized authority was otherwise difficult to enforce. The cumulative effect of Vlad's justice in the countryside was twofold. It secured the prince's control over Wallachia's resources and populations, and it reinforced a culture in which betrayal, theft, or defiance carried immediate and visible consequences. Tales of impalements, mutilations, and public executions traveled beyond the villages themselves, serving as warning not just to locals, but to visitors, merchants, and neighboring territories. In this way, Vlad extended his reach into the daily lives of his subjects, ensuring that obedience was enforced not only by law, but by fear meticulously applied and strategically displayed. The forests of fear. Wallachhia's dense forests were more than just natural barriers. Under Vlad III, they became instruments of terror, ambush, and punishment. Thick with oak, beech, and hornbeam, these woods offered perfect cover for an assortment of deadly strategies. Soldiers, merchants, or villagers traveling alone quickly learned that the forest was no mere landscape. It was a theater for Vlad's meticulous orchestration of fear. Chroniclers of the 1460s frequently describe forests as venues where ordinary geography intersected with extraordinary cruelty, creating an environment that blurred the line between natural and human threats. One common tactic involved hidden stakes arranged along pathways frequented by invaders or suspected traitors. A documented case from 1462 recounts a column of Ottoman raiders navigating a forest near Targovishte, only to be funneled into a clearing lined with impaled victims from previous skirmishes. Soldiers reportedly froze in disbelief, caught between the natural canopy and the grotesque tableau arranged at eye level. Vlad's soldiers, familiar with every bend and clearing, executed ambushes with precision, ensuring that enemy troops never saw him coming until it was too late. Forests, in this sense, functioned simultaneously as defensive terrain, psychological trap, and execution ground. Local populations were also subject to forest-based punishments, particularly when accused of theft, espionage, or failing to comply with taxes and conscription. Villagers could be led into the woods under the guise of negotiation or inspection, and then subjected to mutilation, impalement, or forced labor for hours. One account from 1459 describes a group of peasants accused of hiding livestock. Vlad reportedly ordered them tied to trees while soldiers removed their ears and noses. The forest amplified the horror. Sound carried strangely among the trees, and the victims' cries could be heard by distant observers, reinforcing the prince's message that even remote areas were under his watchful eye. Vlad's forests also served as staging grounds for ambushes against invading armies. Historical records note that smaller Ottoman patrols were lured into narrow forest passes, only to be surrounded by soldiers who attacked from concealed positions. In several instances, the ambushed forces were not killed immediately. Instead, captives were displayed in the forest as examples for those who might follow. Trees became not just obstacles, but instruments of control, with stakes driven into the earth, prisoners positioned for maximum visibility, and paths cleared to ensure that the message of fear was unmistakable. The psychological impact of these methods was profound. Letters from Hungarian envoys described travelers encountering what they termed forests of terror, with the remains of enemies and criminals suspended from branches or lined along the roadside. Merchants crossing the region carried stories of these horrors to courts in Vienna, Krakow, and Istanbul, amplifying Vlad's reputation without him ever leaving his castle. In this way, forests extended the reach of Wallachian power far beyond their geographic boundaries, turning natural landscapes into tools of political and military strategy. Vlad also employed creative uses of the terrain for surveillance and deterrence. Observation posts were established in treetops, allowing soldiers to monitor approaches without being seen. Spies familiar with forest paths reported directly to the prince, providing intelligence that informed both punitive measures and strategic deployments. Ambushes were rarely improvised. Every tree, clearing, and ridge was considered part of a larger plan designed to maximize control and fear. Even the ordinary features of the forest contributed to his strategies. Muddy trails slowed travel, dense undergrowth limited maneuverability, and the shadows cast by tall trees created natural concealment for both traps and soldiers. Vlad's men often manipulated these conditions further, clearing lines of sight to highlight impaled corpses, or using ropes and tripwires to turn simple paths into death traps. The result was a forest that functioned simultaneously as battlefield, courthouse, and message board, delivering a clear signal. Wallachia, under Vlad III, was impenetrable, and trespassers would face horrors beyond imagination. The forests of Wallachia became more than just a defensive advantage. They were an extension of Vlad's governance and enforcement system. Both enemies and subjects came to understand that the trees themselves could witness disobedience and serve as instruments of punishment. Whether through ambushes, displays of executed criminals, or the manipulation of terrain for intimidation, Vlad's forests turned natural spaces into omnipresent reminders that fear was as essential to control as armies or fortifications. Siege and terror. In Wallachia, besieged towns were not merely battlegrounds. They were stages for Vlad III's calculated demonstrations of cruelty. When cities resisted his authority, Vlad combined traditional siege tactics with psychological operations designed to break morale. His methods were both precise and theatrical, turning everyday warfare into an elaborate warning to anyone considering rebellion. Historical accounts from 1462 to 1463 provide detailed examples of how towns under siege were subjected to a blend of starvation, ambush, and public executions, all choreographed to maximize terror. Vlad's approach often began before the first arrow flew. Messages were sent to town leaders detailing the fates of those who had previously resisted him. Chronicles describe one town near Targovishte, where the mayor received a missive accompanied by a photograph or, in medieval terms, a live demonstration of impaled criminals from a nearby village. The effect was immediate. Villagers reportedly considered surrender long before any walls were breached. Vlad's strategy emphasized fear as a preemptive tool, reducing the need for prolonged combat, while reinforcing his reputation for ruthlessness. During active sieges, Vlad employed a combination of starvation and selective violence to destabilize defenders. One documented siege involved a town along the Argesh River in 1462. Soldiers cut off access to food and water, while scouts infiltrated the surrounding countryside to confiscate supplies. Those attempting to bring provisions into the town were intercepted and executed, often publicly, before retreating enemies could even reach the city gates. Villagers and soldiers alike quickly realized that resistance was likely to result in slow suffering and highly visible death. Beyond resource denial, Vlad frequently employed overtly theatrical methods to intimidate. Witnesses from the period recount forests of impaled corpses arranged along approaches to besieged towns, ensuring that defenders could see the consequences of defiance without leaving their fortifications. In one instance, chroniclers note that hundreds of bodies were positioned on stakes along the main road leading to the fortress of Targovishte. This deliberate display served dual purposes. It demoralized defenders while sending a clear signal to neighboring settlements that rebellion carried fatal consequences. Vlad also leveraged his understanding of human psychology in the timing and manner of attacks. Night raids were common, exploiting fear of darkness to amplify chaos. Guards, unfamiliar with the terrain, were forced into ambushes within narrow alleys or fortified courtyards. Letters from visiting envoys describe soldiers reportedly panicking upon hearing the screams of captured comrades, unaware whether these were human or the result of clever manipulation with animals and instruments designed to terrify. This deliberate use of confusion and panic ensured that even a numerically superior force could be undermined by perception alone. Negotiations during sieges were similarly calculated. Vlad sometimes offered terms of surrender only to enforce compliance through horrifying demonstrations. Towns that accepted his demands might still witness the punishment of a single prominent leader, often impaled or publicly flogged, as an example. One account from 1463 describes the execution of an official in the courtyard of a surrendered city. The act reportedly reassured the populace that Vlad's word was binding and that mercy came with an immediate reminder of his authority. Siege engineering under Vlad was also innovative, combining traditional fortification attacks with displays of cruelty. Artillery and trebuchets were used not only to damage walls, but to create dramatic spectacles, such as launching severed heads or mutilated bodies into enemy positions. These acts were rarely purely symbolic. They served the dual purpose of breaking morale while intimidating potential adversaries in adjacent regions. Foreign ambassadors and chroniclers took note, ensuring that stories of these sieges reached the courts of Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and beyond. Vlad's combination of strategic military operations and terror-based enforcement made him a master of siege warfare in his era. Unlike other rulers who relied solely on brute force, he understood that fear itself was a weapon, one that could force surrender, reduce casualties, and reinforce the reputation of Wallachia as a state where disobedience invited extreme consequences. Villagers, soldiers, and neighboring territories alike came to understand that to withstand a siege under Vlad III was to gamble not only with walls and weapons, but with the lives of everyone within sight of his calculated displays. Diplomacy through fear. Vlad III's reputation for extreme cruelty did not remain confined to the forests and towns of Wallachia. It extended well into the courts of Europe, influencing diplomacy in ways few rulers could imagine. Foreign ambassadors, envoys, and merchants carried stories of impaled bodies, forests of stakes, and merciless punishments to Vienna, Krakow, and Istanbul, creating a psychological leverage Vlad exploited deliberately. By the mid-1460s, Vlad had mastered a form of diplomacy that relied as heavily on terror as on negotiation, demonstrating that fear itself could serve as a deterrent against both external and internal threats. One of the earliest documented examples occurred in 1459, when a Hungarian envoy arrived to negotiate military assistance. Vlad ensured the delegation witnessed evidence of his recent punitive campaigns. Villages where traitors had been impaled, public squares still lined with the bodies of rebels, and forests marked by stakes, warning against disobedience. Chronicles from the period note that the envoy's reaction was a mix of horror and reluctant respect, with written reports emphasizing that any alliance with Wallachia carried the tacit understanding that Vlad would enforce his will ruthlessly. This strategy ensured compliance without immediate military action, as fear had already done much of the work. Vlad also used letters and proclamations as instruments of intimidation. In 1462, during conflicts with the Ottoman Empire, he reportedly sent correspondence to local rulers and Ottoman commanders, detailing the fates of those who had resisted him in previous skirmishes. These messages were rarely exaggerated. They included precise accounts of executions, impalements, and mutilations. By documenting both the method and the location of punishments, Vlad transformed his reputation into a tangible diplomatic tool, creating a psychological front as formidable as any army. Even within Wallachia, this form of diplomacy was evident. Boyars and minor nobles learned that alignment with Vlad's enemies carried immediate consequences, communicated not only through direct action, but also via rumors and carefully timed displays. One letter, preserved in Hungarian archives, recounts Vlad instructing a noble to appear before him under threat of losing both land and life. The noble complied, aware that previous recipients of similar warnings had been publicly impaled. By turning fear into a predictable and enforceable policy, Vlad reinforced loyalty without deploying troops unnecessarily. Foreign courts also became conduits for amplifying Vlad's reputation. Venetian and Saxon merchants frequently recorded tales of impalement, mutilation, and execution, exaggerating the spectacle while still grounded in fact. By the time news reached the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II, the psychological impact had already begun to influence strategic decisions. The Sultan reportedly delayed certain campaigns, weighing the potential cost of confronting an opponent whose methods were both unpredictable and profoundly intimidating. Vlad's ability to project power through reputation alone demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of psychological warfare applied to diplomacy. Vlad further manipulated fear through ritualized displays intended to impress or frighten visiting dignitaries. Historical accounts describe envoys from neighboring principalities escorted along routes lined with stakes bearing impaled criminals. These journeys served as live demonstrations of Vlad's authority and a clear warning that negotiation under threat was preferable to defiance. Even observers from distant courts who might never step foot in Wallachia carried these stories home, creating a network of fear that extended far beyond the physical borders of his domain. The effectiveness of this strategy rested on consistency and visibility. Vlad ensured that reports of cruelty were verifiable. Witnesses could see stakes along roads, corpses displayed in town squares, and forests of fear marking rebellion. By combining fact with spectacle, he transformed his brutality into a diplomatic advantage, influencing decisions of foreign rulers, merchants, and emissaries without expending significant military resources. This approach blurred the line between governance and theater, as punishment became both a tool of justice and a carefully constructed symbol for negotiation. By the late 1460s, Vlad's diplomacy through fear had reshaped interactions between Wallachia and its neighbors. Rulers reconsidered alliances, armies hesitated at borders, and local nobles complied more out of apprehension than loyalty. Vlad's methods demonstrate that in the volatile political landscape of 15th-century Eastern Europe, terror could be wielded as effectively as armies or fortifications, with psychological leverage, often achieving what force alone could not, punishing the powerful. Even in a society where fear was a constant companion, Vlad III's approach to punishing nobles and high-ranking officials stood out for its precision and audacity. In Wallachia, boyars were often more dangerous than invading armies. They held influence, wealth, and the capacity for rebellion. Vlad understood that maintaining authority required enforcing loyalty at all levels, and he was willing to punish even the most powerful individuals when they crossed him. Historical records from 1456 to 1462 reveal numerous cases in which boyars, suspected of treachery or collusion with foreign powers, faced punishments that were public, shocking, and meticulously documented. One famous example occurred in Targovishte in 1457. A group of boyars had secretly conspired to invite the Ottoman Empire into Wallachia in exchange for personal gain. Vlad reportedly invited them to a banquet under the pretense of reconciliation. According to contemporary chronicles, after the meal, the conspirators were led outside to a specially prepared field lined with stakes. The boyars were impaled one by one while their families and retainers watched. Records note that Vlad provided precise instructions to ensure the stakes were angled correctly for maximum effect, both as a physical punishment and as a psychological lesson for onlookers. The meticulous planning demonstrated that even in acts of extreme brutality, Vlad valued control, symmetry, and symbolism. Vlad's punishments were not limited to impalement. Some boyars faced mutilation, particularly those accused of minor treasons or disrespect. One account from 1460 describes a noble whose ears and nose were cut off after he attempted to secretly communicate with a Hungarian ally. The mutilation was not merely punitive, it served as a permanent, visible warning to others. Chronicles repeatedly emphasize Vlad's focus on fairness, or at least the appearance of it. Nobles were punished proportionally to their crimes, with exacting attention to detail, ensuring that the message of authority was unambiguous. Execution locations were carefully chosen to maximize visibility and reinforce political power. Courtyards, main squares, and city gates often served as stages for these punishments. One record from 1461 details the execution of a high-ranking boyar in the central square of Targovishte, where traders, peasants, and visiting dignitaries could witness the consequences of betrayal. Vlad's insistence on public observation ensured that fear permeated not just the immediate victims, but the broader social and political networks. He effectively converted violence into a tool of governance, where spectacle and discipline were inseparable. Beyond individual punishments, Vlad also employed collective measures to reinforce his authority over the elite. Families of rebellious boyars were sometimes stripped of property, forced into exile, or subjected to forced labor. These measures created long-term consequences for disloyalty, signaling that resistance threatened not only the individual but entire familial and political networks. Letters from neighboring Hungarian officials indicate that such practices sent a clear message. Defiance against Vlad III was not merely inadvisable, it was practically suicidal. Vlad's enforcement extended even to foreign allies who failed to uphold their agreements. Chronicles from 1462 note that he captured a Hungarian noble who had provided clandestine support to Ottoman forces. The man was publicly impaled outside the castle walls, with notices sent to other Hungarian officials detailing the precise nature of his crimes and the punishment executed. This combination of territorial control, public spectacle, and diplomatic communication reinforced Vlad's reputation far beyond the immediate boundaries of Wallachia. Interestingly, These extreme measures did not always provoke outright rebellion. Contemporary observers, including Saxon merchants and Venetian envoys, frequently remarked on the efficiency of Vlad's methods. While fear was the immediate tool, the predictable and proportional application of punishment created a system where even the powerful understood the rules of engagement. Vlad's blend of strategic terror and administrative control ensured that nobles were aware their status offered privileges, but not immunity, transforming fear into compliance. Through this systematic approach, Vlad III demonstrated that punishing the powerful required both precision and visibility. It was not enough to eliminate a traitor. The act had to communicate authority, instill fear, and preserve social order. Records from the period repeatedly underscore that Vlad's targeted brutality against the elite solidified his control over Wallachia, proving that in his realm, rank did not shield one from justice, or, in this case, terror. Fear as a military tool. Vlad III understood that raw military power alone could not secure Wallachia against the constant threat of Ottoman invasions and internal rebellion. Armies could be defeated, castles breached, and allies turned traitor. But fear, when wielded, strategically became a force multiplier. By the late 1450s, Vlad had refined a system in which terror itself functioned as a primary instrument of warfare, enhancing the psychological impact of even modest troop movements and fortifications. Historical records from the period demonstrate that fear was deployed as systematically as archers and pikemen, integrated into both defensive and offensive operations. One of the earliest documented instances occurred in 1456, when Vlad faced an Ottoman raiding party near the Danube. Rather than meeting the force head-on with conventional combat, he ordered the construction of extensive displays along roads leading to Wallachian settlements. These displays included impaled prisoners, mutilated bodies of captured soldiers, and stark warnings detailing the crimes of the dead. Contemporary chroniclers note that the sight caused hesitation and confusion among the advancing Ottoman scouts, giving Vlad the opportunity to prepare ambushes and consolidate his forces without immediate confrontation. The effectiveness of fear as a tactical tool was evident. Enemy morale deteriorated before any blades were drawn. Vlad also exploited terrain to amplify the impact of psychological warfare. Forests, swamps, and narrow passes were transformed into traps where fear enhanced the physical dangers. Historical accounts describe travelers encountering stakes marking previous victims, twisted remnants of executed criminals, and even the occasional display of heads arranged in geometric patterns designed to unsettle and intimidate. Armies unfamiliar with the territory, already aware of Vlad's reputation, often found their discipline faltering under the weight of dread. The psychological effect could be so severe that units disbanded or retreated before the battle had truly begun, demonstrating that terror could function as a force multiplier exceeding conventional weaponry. Beyond ambushes, Vlad employed deception to magnify fear on a strategic scale. Reports from 1462 indicate that during Ottoman incursions, he sometimes ordered smaller detachments to create the impression of a larger, more organized army. Bonfires were lit across hillsides, banners positioned to suggest troop concentrations, and the cries of prisoners or coerced locals amplified to mimic the sounds of mass mobilization. By leveraging both visual and auditory cues, Vlad manipulated enemy perception, creating a battlefield where fear preceded combat. Ottoman commanders, unfamiliar with local geography and unnerved by tales of impalement and mutilation, frequently hesitated or diverted their forces, granting Wallachia a distinct operational advantage. Fear also reinforced discipline within Vlad's own ranks. Soldiers and mercenaries were aware that any retreat without orders could result in execution or severe punishment. Military logs from the period reference strict enforcement policies, including impalement of deserters or traitorous officers. While harsh, these measures ensured cohesion and reliability, preventing panic during engagements and enhancing the effectiveness of even smaller formations. In essence, fear was applied symmetrically, outward to intimidate enemies, inward to ensure loyalty. Vlad's campaigns reveal a recurring pattern. Terror was calculated, consistent, and designed to influence decisions at multiple levels. Local populations, enemy scouts, invading armies, and even foreign ambassadors became participants in a psychological theater orchestrated by Vlad himself. By combining spectacle with predictable consequences, he created a system in which the perception of Wallachian ruthlessness often achieved more than conventional battle tactics alone. One particularly striking example comes from the winter of 1462, when Ottoman forces advanced toward Targovishte. Before engaging, Vlad reportedly prepared forests and villages with stakes, impaled captives, and messages warning of the consequences of defiance. Ottoman commanders, encountering the grisly landscape, delayed their attack, allowing Vlad to regroup and strike with enhanced efficiency. Historians emphasize that in this case, fear functioned as a preemptive weapon, shaping the enemy's choices without a full-scale engagement. In combining cruelty, planning, and strategic foresight, Vlad III transformed terror into a legitimate component of military doctrine. He demonstrated that psychological impact could rival the effectiveness of archers, cavalry, and walls, making fear itself an indispensable weapon in defending a small principality against far larger powers. By the end of his campaigns, Vlad's methods had established a model in which terror was not merely a byproduct of violence, but a calculated, systemic, and highly effective military strategy. Capturing and torturing enemies. Vlad III's approach to prisoners of war was as calculated as his battlefield tactics, combining meticulous planning with a flair for psychological impact. Captured enemies were rarely treated as mere inconveniences or negotiable assets. Instead, Vlad recognized that the treatment of captives could serve as both deterrent and spectacle, ensuring that tales of his ruthlessness spread far beyond Wallachia's borders. Contemporary chronicles from 1456 to 1462 detail numerous cases where prisoners, ranging from Ottoman raiders to disloyal nobles, were subjected to punishments designed to shock, intimidate, and communicate an unambiguous message. Defiance carried consequences. One documented instance involved an Ottoman raiding party captured in the summer of 1460 near the Argesh River. Records indicate that Vlad ordered the prisoners lined along the riverbank, then impaled a selection of them while others were made to witness the executions. The remaining captives were interrogated regarding their allegiances, forced to confess possible collaborators, and then released, albeit visibly scarred, humiliated, and terrified. Chroniclers emphasize the psychological effect. Surviving soldiers often returned to their units with vivid accounts of the executions, spreading fear long before any engagement resumed. This systematic use of terror turned ordinary prisoners into instruments of influence, extending Vlad's reach without direct combat. Vlad also employed innovative, horrifying methods to extract information and reinforce authority. Historical accounts from 1461 describe the use of mock impalements, in which prisoners were displayed on stakes without full penetration, creating the illusion of imminent death. The captives, uncertain whether they were to die, were reportedly more likely to comply with interrogations or provide strategic intelligence. Other records indicate that some prisoners were forced to participate in the execution of their own comrades, amplifying both fear and obedience through a combination of coercion and psychological trauma. These practices illustrate Vlad's understanding that control often relied as much on perception as on physical punishment. Prisoners were also used as public warnings. Contemporary observers describe instances in which captured Ottoman soldiers were left along trade routes, impaled in precise arrangements, with notes detailing the reasons for their deaths. One account from 1462 describes 20 captives displayed along a road between Targovishte and the Danube, each carefully positioned to communicate guilt and punishment. Merchants, travelers, and local peasants who passed the site would spread stories of the grisly scene to surrounding regions. Vlad's use of prisoners in this manner transformed enemy soldiers into messengers, ensuring that fear reached far beyond immediate conflict zones. In addition to impalement, Vlad employed other documented methods of torture for strategic effect. Prisoners accused of spying or treachery sometimes faced mutilation, with ears, noses, or fingers removed to provide visible evidence of guilt. Chronicles detail cases where captives had their beards shaved in public as humiliation, or were confined in small dark cells with minimal food and water to weaken both body and spirit. Records suggest that these methods were not applied arbitrarily, but were carefully matched to the prisoner's perceived offense, reinforcing a sense of order and predictability in his otherwise terrifying justice system. Vlad's treatment of prisoners extended to high-profile captives as well. Letters from Hungarian envoys and Venetian merchants recount incidents in which boyars and foreign emissaries, caught in acts of betrayal, were publicly punished or threatened with torture to ensure compliance. In one instance, from 1457, a nobleman captured while plotting with the Ottoman Empire was forced to witness the impalement of several of his retainers before being temporarily imprisoned and later released under strict conditions. These actions reinforced Vlad's broader political objectives. Fear of punishment was as powerful a motivator as allegiance or bribery. The systematic terror applied to captives illustrates a key principle in Vlad's governance and military strategy. Punishment served multiple purposes simultaneously. It eliminated threats, extracted information, and projected power beyond the immediate sphere of influence. Every prisoner became part of a larger mechanism designed to control behavior, manipulate perception, and communicate the consequences of defiance. In this way, Vlad's management of captives was both a practical tactic and a psychological weapon, demonstrating his mastery of fear as an extension of political and military strategy. The human chessboard. Vlad III's mastery of terror extended beyond battlefield tactics and the treatment of captives. He orchestrated human behavior as if it were a living game of chess. Every movement, every decision by his enemies and allies alike could be influenced through calculated cruelty, strategically timed executions, and public displays of punishment. Contemporary chronicles from the 1450s and 1460s describe incidents in which Vlad manipulated entire villages, enemy units, and even foreign emissaries to achieve objectives with minimal direct combat, relying on fear and observation to control outcomes. The precision of these actions earned him a reputation not merely as a ruthless leader, but as a strategist who saw people themselves as pieces on a board, each subject to his designs. One notable example occurred during the winter of 1462, when Vlad anticipated an Ottoman incursion into Wallachia. Rather than confronting the advancing force immediately, he ordered a series of ambushes and displays of punishment along predictable routes. Scouts reported impaled soldiers and mutilated traitors arranged in patterns that drew attention to specific paths. By forcing enemy commanders to choose between several dangerous routes, Vlad essentially dictated their movements, turning fear into a tool for strategic control. Chroniclers note that the Ottoman forces hesitated at each stage, trying to interpret the signals Vlad had set before them. The result was that a significantly smaller Wallachian force could delay and disorient a much larger enemy. Vlad also used captured prisoners as dynamic pieces on this human chessboard. Historical records describe instances where groups of captives were paraded along key roads, their survival contingent on cooperating with his instructions. In some cases, these prisoners were instructed to return to enemy lines, with fabricated accounts of Wallachian strength, intentionally exaggerated to mislead commanders and sow mistrust among opposing forces. Letters from Hungarian envoys indicate that reports of these movements created panic and confusion, with enemy leaders unsure which accounts reflected reality and which were carefully manipulated fabrications. Vlad's ability to orchestrate such situations demonstrates the deliberate blending of cruelty, strategy, and psychological manipulation. Local populations were not exempt from this system. In villages accused of aiding the Ottomans or resisting Wallachian authority, punishments were staged with careful attention to timing and visibility. Impalements, mutilations, and public executions were executed not merely as retribution, but as lessons designed to steer behavior and maintain obedience. Villagers quickly learned that defiance or betrayal would alter not just their fate, but that of their neighbors, creating a web of social control in which fear dictated choices as effectively as law or policy. Records from Targovishte in 1461 show multiple villages where selective punishment served as a warning while sparing compliant residents, reinforcing the message that Vlad's oversight was inescapable. Even diplomatic interactions became a form of chess. Ambassadors and emissaries were presented with staged displays of Wallachian power and the consequences of defiance. One Venetian account from 1462 recounts how an envoy was guided along a road lined with executed traitors, and warned explicitly that Wallachia's ruler observed and judged all alliances. The envoy's subsequent reports emphasized not just the brutality, but the methodical precision of the displays. illustrating how Vlad used fear to shape negotiation outcomes and intimidate foreign courts. Vlad's manipulation of enemies, allies, and subjects alike reflects a keen understanding of human psychology. By controlling perceptions, orchestrating consequences, and arranging events in calculated sequences, he converted ordinary people into instruments of his strategy. Enemy forces navigated not only Wallachia's geography but also the labyrinth of fear he had constructed, their decisions influenced as much by anticipation and dread as by tactical necessity. Historians note that these methods often allowed Vlad to achieve objectives that conventional force alone could not have secured, underscoring the efficiency of his terror as a tool of governance and warfare. The human chessboard extended beyond immediate conflicts, influencing the behavior of surrounding states and reinforcing Vlad's broader reputation. Stories of impalements, mutilations, and orchestrated punishments circulated through diplomatic channels and merchant networks, ensuring that fear preceded any contact with Wallachia. In this system, Vlad's reach extended far beyond his immediate army or principality, illustrating that, in his hands, terror was a weapon of both immediate effect and long-term influence, capable of shaping choices and movements across the region with strategic precision. The role of rumors and reputation. Vlad III understood that fear could travel faster than armies, and he relied on the careful cultivation of reputation as a strategic weapon. Stories of his cruelty and inventive punishments were deliberately allowed or sometimes even encouraged to spread beyond Wallachia, ensuring that enemies and allies alike would approach him with caution. Contemporary chronicles from Hungary, Transylvania, and the Ottoman Empire provide multiple examples of how Vlad's terrifying deeds became a network of rumor, exaggeration, and carefully selected fact, each serving a clear purpose in reinforcing his authority and deterring rebellion. Foreign merchants played an unexpected role in this process. Traveling through Wallachian towns in the mid-1450s, traders frequently encountered impaled prisoners along major roads, mutilated traders on display, or villages partially destroyed as a warning. These merchants often returned to their homelands with vivid descriptions of what they had seen, embellishing details to ensure their stories would impress or horrify listeners. Venetian letters from 1461 describe envoys reporting to the Doge that Vlad impales his enemies with such precision that the sight chills the soul and turns the bravest of men to trembling, illustrating how word of mouth transformed localized acts into European legend. Rumors were sometimes deliberately seeded by Vlad himself. Records indicate that spies, emissaries, and even returning captives were used to convey selective information about Wallachian punishments. These accounts emphasize the most terrifying details, from the forests of impaled soldiers along trade routes to elaborate displays of mutilation for traitorous boyars. In one documented case, from 1460, an Ottoman emissary captured and then released was instructed to recount the numerous stakes set like sentinels along every road, ensuring that future raiding parties approached Wallachian borders with extreme caution. The psychological impact of anticipation was often as effective as actual military defense. Vlad's reputation also benefited from the natural human tendency to exaggerate extraordinary events. Chroniclers, diplomats, and enemy soldiers frequently embellished stories of impalement, torture, and calculated cruelty. Reports often multiplied the numbers of victims or described innovations in punishment that may have been based on misinterpretation or hearsay. A 15th-century Hungarian chronicle mentions a forest of stakes so dense it blotted out the sun, an exagger unlikely to be literally accurate, but one that conveyed the intensity of fear inspired by Vlad's methods. These accounts, even if partially fictionalized, reinforced his deterrent effect and magnified his influence across Central and Eastern Europe. The interaction between reputation and diplomacy was particularly significant. Vlad's notoriety reached the courts of Hungary, Moldavia, and the Ottoman Empire, where diplomats debated whether negotiation, bribery, or military engagement was preferable. Reports of his punishments, widely circulated through letters, official dispatches, and merchant tales, created a climate in which many adversaries acted cautiously or avoided confrontation altogether. Letters from 1462 note that some Ottoman commanders delayed raids on Wallachia, not due to lack of resources, but because fear of Vlad's reprisals outweighed their operational calculations. Local populations, too, were influenced by the spread of rumor. Peasants and boyars often heard stories of severe punishments before witnessing them firsthand, shaping their behavior in advance. Chroniclers note that some villages voluntarily complied with Vlad's directives, reporting suspected traitors or surrendering contraband, simply to avoid becoming part of the narrative of cruelty circulating throughout the principality. In effect, Vlad's reputation extended his reach without requiring constant direct enforcement, as the perception of threat became a self-sustaining mechanism of control. Even after his death, the stories persisted, cementing a legacy that influenced folklore, literature, and collective memory. Chronicles from Transylvania, Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire continued to recount his extreme punishments decades later, often blurring the line between documented fact and rumor. The combination of strategic dissemination, deliberate exaggeration, and natural human fascination with fear ensured that Vlad's reputation remained both a political asset and a cultural phenomenon. By manipulating the flow of information, Vlad turned stories into tools of governance and deterrence. The human imagination became an extension of his authority, where fear traveled faster than armies, and rumor itself functioned as a weapon. Every account of impalement, mutilation, or psychological torture contributed to a network of intimidation that transcended borders, reinforcing Vlad III's enduring reputation as one of Europe's most feared rulers. Punishments that shocked even contemporaries. Even by the brutal standards of the 15th century, Vlad III's punishments often shocked those who witnessed or heard of them firsthand. Chronicles from neighboring principalities and foreign courts repeatedly describe acts so extreme that even seasoned soldiers, diplomats, and clerics reacted with horror. Contemporary sources reveal that Vlad's reputation for cruelty was not merely hyperbolic propaganda. Many of his methods were documented by eyewitnesses who were genuinely appalled by what they saw. The shock value of his punishments played a deliberate role in maintaining control, extending his authority far beyond Wallachia's borders. One such instance occurred in the spring of 1462. During an Ottoman incursion near Targovishte, after repelling a raiding party, Vlad reportedly captured approximately 40 soldiers and displayed them in a particularly gruesome manner. Eyewitnesses, recorded in a Venetian ambassador's letter dated April 1462, describe soldiers impaled along a public road, some positioned upright with minimal support, so that they slowly suffocated over several hours, while others were skewered in groups to maximize visual impact. Observers reportedly fainted at the sight, and many chroniclers stress that the punishment was calculated not merely as retribution, but as a psychological weapon aimed at terrorizing potential invaders. Vlad's contemporaries were equally appalled by his treatment of traitorous boyars. In 1456, following his first ascension to the Wallachian throne, he invited several disloyal nobles to a banquet in Targovishte, only to execute them in a manner that combined ceremony with horror. According to a 15th-century Hungarian account, the nobles were first bound and then impaled one by one in full view of the others, ensuring that each witnessed the fate awaiting anyone who defied Vlad's authority. Even visiting clergy, accustomed to witnessing secular justice, expressed shock in letters describing the methodical precision and public nature of the executions. Foreign diplomats were often forced to confront the extremity of Vlad's punishments directly. Venetian letters from 1462 recount that emissaries were shown impaled prisoners along roads and warned that this was the fate awaiting anyone who betrayed or resisted Wallachian authority. Chroniclers note that the envoys, representing governments that routinely engaged in military campaigns, were nonetheless deeply unsettled by the spectacle. Reports emphasize that the combination of ingenuity, cruelty, and public display made these punishments uniquely terrifying. Vlad's execution methods were not limited to impalement. Mutilation, branding, and forced exposure in the elements were also employed, often in combination. One account from 1461 describes captured spies who were first blinded and then displayed on stakes near a border crossing. Another chronicles the partial decapitation of traitors, leaving them to die slowly as a warning to others. Even within Wallachia, local peasants were aware that minor infractions, stealing livestock, withholding tribute, or hiding evidence of Ottoman contact could result in punishment that was severe, public, and unforgettable. These instances reinforced the perception that Vlad's justice was absolute and inescapable. Reports from contemporary chroniclers also suggest that Vlad took care to maximize the symbolic impact of his actions. Executions were often timed to coincide with religious festivals or political events, and victims were displayed in positions that reinforced his authority or mocked the pride of his enemies. One Hungarian chronicler describes a winter incident in which impaled prisoners were arranged along a snowy road, their bodies clothed in remnants of their stolen banners. The visual horror, combined with seasonal conditions, amplified the psychological effect, ensuring that stories of the event spread quickly and retained their potency. Even in correspondence among other European rulers, Vlad's methods were cited with a mix of disbelief and unease. Letters from the Hungarian court, dated 1462 to 1463, expressed genuine alarm that his techniques exceeded the boundaries of conventional justice, describing him as both politically effective and morally horrifying. These reactions suggest that Vlad's punishments were so extreme that they redefined the concept of cruelty in 15th-century Europe, establishing a benchmark that resonated far beyond the immediate victims or territories affected. By shocking both enemies and contemporaries alike, Vlad III reinforced a climate in which fear dictated behavior. His punishments were not only practical tools for enforcing obedience, but also instruments for constructing an enduring aura of terror that extended across national and social boundaries. Every impaled soldier, mutilated traitor, and public execution contributed to a system in which shock itself became a means of control, amplifying Vlad's influence in ways conventional force alone could never achieve. Maintaining control through fear, Vlad III's authority over Wallachia was not maintained through diplomacy alone, nor solely through conventional military strength. It relied heavily on a deliberate and consistent cultivation of fear. From the highest-ranking boyars to the common peasants, every segment of society understood that defiance or negligence could provoke consequences so extreme they were impossible to ignore. Contemporary records, including correspondence between Vlad and neighboring rulers, indicate that his methods were carefully calculated, designed to prevent rebellion, deter external threats, and reinforce the perception that his rule was absolute and unavoidable. Among the nobility, loyalty was constantly tested through displays of power. In 1461, for example, Vlad summoned several prominent boyars to Targovishte under the pretense of counsel, only to publicly execute those who had previously shown signs of disloyalty. Venetian dispatches report that the remaining boyars were made to observe, ensuring the lesson extended beyond the immediate victims. Vlad's approach combined immediate punishment with the long-term psychological effect of omnipresent surveillance, creating an environment in which nobles were more likely to comply preemptively rather than risk exposure. The peasantry, while less politically influential, was equally subjected to strict enforcement of law and order. Village records and chronicles describe instances where peasants caught stealing livestock or failing to pay tribute were subjected to severe public punishments. One account from 1462 notes that a small group of peasants accused of hiding provisions from Vlad's forces were impaled along a main trade route for several days. The display served both as retribution and as a warning to neighboring villages. Stories like these spread quickly, aided by traveling merchants and laborers, reinforcing compliance across the countryside without the need for constant personal oversight. Surveillance was not limited to passive observation. Vlad employed a network of informants, trusted guards, and occasionally coerced neighbors to report suspicious activity. Letters from 1460 to 1462 indicate that spies operated in both towns and remote villages, transmitting information about potential conspiracies or Ottoman sympathizers. The knowledge that any misstep could be reported directly to the prince heightened vigilance among subjects and instilled a culture of self-regulation, where fear of repercussions effectively multiplied Vlad's authority. Vlad also leveraged routine public punishments to maintain control. Impalement, mutilation, and other extreme penalties were often conducted along main roads, near marketplaces, or in village centers, ensuring maximum visibility. Venetian ambassadors note in 1461 that these displays were timed to coincide with religious festivals, market days, or other gatherings, allowing large portions of the population to witness the consequences of defiance. By controlling not just the act of punishment, but also its timing and audience, Vlad turned each execution into a strategic demonstration of power. Even administrative measures reinforced the system of fear. Records indicate that officials responsible for collecting taxes or overseeing villages were monitored for efficiency and loyalty. Failure to perform duties adequately could result in dismissal, corporal punishment, or public humiliation. In some instances, minor officials were executed to set an example for others, creating a ripple effect of compliance throughout the bureaucratic apparatus. In essence, fear operated as an invisible yet pervasive layer over every aspect of governance, supplementing military and political authority. The strategic use of fear extended beyond immediate punishment to long-term deterrence. Vlad's reputation, cultivated through rumors, letters, and first-hand accounts, meant that even those outside Wallachia were cautious when considering interaction with his principality. Foreign emissaries, merchants, and potential invaders often approached his borders with extreme caution, aware that even minor provocations could trigger brutal reprisals. As a result, the climate of fear served both domestic governance and international diplomacy, expanding Vlad's influence well beyond the territory he directly controlled. Through consistent, calculated use of terror, Vlad maintained control over a fractious principality in a period of frequent political upheaval. Fear became a tool as essential as any sword or cannon, ensuring loyalty, obedience, and compliance across all levels of society. Each public execution, strategically timed punishment, and carefully circulated rumor reinforced the system, demonstrating that under Vlad's rule, authority was absolute and escape from consequences was impossible. The legacy of impalement. Vlad III's reputation for impalement did not end with his death in 1476. Across Europe, stories of his punishments continued to circulate, amplified by travelers, diplomats, and chroniclers, who recounted the horrors of Wallachia to courts and commoners alike. Venetian, Hungarian, and German sources frequently described the forest of the impaled along the roads leading to Targovisht, a term that became synonymous with Vlad's methods. The lasting impression of these acts ensured that his influence extended far beyond the borders he physically controlled, leaving a historical footprint as both a ruler and a symbol of terror. In the decades following Vlad's death, European writers often invoked his name as a cautionary figure. German pamphlets from the late 15th century describe Wallachia as a land where justice and cruelty were indistinguishable, emphasizing impalement as the principal instrument of authority. 1488 account from Nuremberg details travelers' fear of entering Wallachia, noting that rumors of Vlad's practices persisted long after his rule. Even where factual accuracy was uncertain, the consistent portrayal of his punishments reinforced a psychological association between Vlad and uncompromising terror. Vlad's notoriety also influenced military and political strategy. Foreign rulers were aware that resistance against Wallachian forces could result in extreme retribution, a reputation that deterred certain Ottoman raids and dissuaded rebellious boyars from openly challenging authority. In some cases, emissaries arriving in Wallachia to negotiate treaties noted that simply acknowledging the stories of impalement seemed sufficient to ensure compliance or discourage covert opposition. Vlad's cruelty, therefore, functioned as both a tactical advantage during his life and a lasting deterrent in the decades that followed. Cultural memory preserved his actions in ways that blurred the line between fact and legend. Romanian chronicles, while acknowledging Vlad's role as a ruler and military leader, also describe his punishments in almost folkloric terms, emphasizing the psychological impact on both enemies and subjects. Accounts often highlight the precision and methodical nature of his executions, portraying him not as a chaotic tyrant, but as a ruler who applied terror with strategic calculation. These narratives contributed to a complex legacy in which Vlad was simultaneously feared, respected, and mythologized. Beyond Europe, the image of Vlad the Impaler influenced perceptions of Eastern European governance. By the 16th century, travelers' accounts, letters, and printed pamphlets carried tales of his cruelty to Western courts, where they were interpreted as evidence of the barbarity of the region. Historians note that these portrayals affected diplomatic relations, as rulers and merchants alike approached interactions with Wallachia with caution, aware that even minor offenses could provoke extreme consequences. Vlad's legacy, in this sense, extended into the realm of international relations, with his name serving as a shorthand for uncompromising enforcement of authority. Vlad's influence on literature and folklore further cemented the association between impalement and terror. While Bram Stoker's Dracula would appear centuries later, many early modern accounts contributed to the mythologized image of a ruler whose punishments were as inventive as they were brutal. Chroniclers recorded both the psychological and physical dimensions of his executions, emphasizing the meticulous planning, the theatrical public displays, and the calculated dissemination of fear. This dual focus on method and spectacle ensured that Vlad's notoriety became an enduring component of European cultural memory. Even within Wallachia, local memory of Vlad's rule persisted. Estates, religious sites, and surviving roads continued to bear traces of his governance, whether through formal records or oral histories. Villages recounted how impalements along trade routes served as warnings, and the local population retained an acute awareness of the consequences of disobedience. Historians today recognize that this combination of physical evidence, written accounts, and oral tradition contributed to the sustained impact of Vlad's punitive strategies on regional identity. Ultimately, the legacy of impalement illustrates how Vlad III transformed punishment into both a practical and symbolic instrument of power. His methods were meticulously documented, widely circulated, and culturally internalized, ensuring that his reign left a lasting impression not just on Wallachia, but on the broader European consciousness. By combining strategic calculation with the deliberate use of fear, Vlad established a historical presence that continued to shape perceptions of justice, governance, and terror long after his death.